So, you have to wonder about the folks leading Duke Energy. What made them think it was okay to dump the coal ash in those neighborhoods? And I would say this system that teaches in overt ways and sometimes in subtle ways that not all lives matter in the way, to that way of thinking, made it possible for them to choose to put coal ash near these communities. It also made it possible for other people to overlook what was going on. And one of the things that I think we don't talk about enough in terms of how racism works, but this election is really bringing it to the front, is that racism works to divide people. It's oppressing people, and that's important in its own right, but it's also dividing people. It obscures the depth of the problem. So that lots of people in North Carolina didn't realize that they were at risk from coal ash because it wasn't in their backyard. On a bigger scale, I think we couldn't really continue in any kind of conscience using fossil fuels if we recognized the effect that it really had. Part of the way that we coal in Appalachia is a process called mountaintop removal coal mining. How many people know about that? Oh, good, more. Anybody want to give a one-liner on what it is?
Well, it's actually stripping off the top of the mountain. It used to be called strip mining, and instead of what you're calling it. But that's essentially just taking the top off instead of going into the earth. They're just trying to bring it to themselves, essentially.
Yeah, and mountaintop removal is an especially devastating form of strip mining where they actually blow up the top of the mountain. And then dump the debris in streams. So it causes cancer, it causes birth defects. And this is most common in Appalachia. Now, it's a white working class area predominantly, but it's also an area that's been really viciously stereotyped. As near as I can figure, from about the time people figured out they were living on top of coal, Appalachians have been stereotyped. And so people in Appalachia have their health put at risk by the way we produce coal. People in North Carolina have their health put at risk from the way we dispose of the coal ash. Burning the coal causes asthma in places like Philadelphia, and climate change. So what would happen if all those different groups of people saw themselves as having a common problem? Don't you think it would be easier for us to fix it and address it? In fact, the Quaker Action Team used to work on mountaintop removal coal mining in Appalachia. And when we chose that campaign, some of our African American friends said, Appalachia? Really? That's the first place you're going? That was a very painful thing because I realized that those communities have been taught to distrust each other rather than see themselves as from the broken system. So part of the reason I think it's important for us to talk about racism along with climate change is I don't see how, I think racism helps to prop up the system that we have by keeping people divided. And I think addressing it will help us be more likely to find common solutions, like they're trying to do in New York. Let me pause and see if you're with me so far. Any questions about this so far?
I'll try an example. I've been down to Appalachia a couple of times. And there's big signs all around that says, coal keeps the lights on.
Right.
They're not interested necessarily in getting rid of coal because that's going to have a negative impact on them. But what I get out of your statement, and this is why I'm kind of checking this, is that's only their narrow perspective. They don't see themselves as part of the bigger system. And are you saying then
Great. I'm glad you're asking me this question.
Yeah. Are you saying then that if we help them to see that they're part of a bigger system, that they may be willing to give up their livelihood?
So let me say two things about that. First, what you saw was a billboard paid for by the coal industry.
Oh, of course.
Maybe by the union, but probably backed by the coal industry. That doesn't necessarily represent everyone in Appalachia. The folks who we worked with were fighting very hard to stop mountaintop removal. I heard a talk one time by a woman who's a nurse, a pediatric nurse in Appalachia, and she had horrible stories about the conditions that children were born with because of the stuff in their drinking water. It is true that a lot of people are afraid of losing jobs, and that is a common way people are pitted against each other. Even in Philadelphia around the energy hub, jobs versus clean water. And the truth is that the coal industry has actually kept out other kinds of jobs. Toyota wanted to build a big plant, I think it was in West Virginia, and the coal industry used their political influence to keep Toyota out because that would give people more choices. So I think we have to work at lots of levels. I think we have to be concerned about the job thing, but not assume that people on the ground don't care about these issues. The Appalachians who I know are already thinking big picture, are already partnering with other groups and seeing themselves as part of a global movement. And it's part of what's been really exciting in the last few years as the climate movement has grown. At the People's Climate March in New York, anybody go to that? Okay, a couple. It was 400,000 people. It was led by what they call frontline communities. And those are the communities at risk. So people from Appalachia were up front with Native Americans and First Nations people and people from other communities that are mostly affected by these issues. So I think it is happening, but I am saying that if we carry more awareness of this, it will help connections.
And balanced against the weight of lobbyists and large corporations that have their own interests.
And that's exactly why we need people power. It's the only thing that counteracts that. Any other questions about what I've said so far? Okay.
I very much appreciate your connection between the difficulty that some people have with the idea that racism only affects people of color, and that in fact it's an artificial divider. So we won't actually focus on issues that go even beyond the environmental. But it's going to be a hard sell. But it's forums like this and bringing up in the dialogue, I think that it's going to be the only way that we see it for what it really is. So it's going to be a hard sell from both sides. Because on people of color, they're very suspicious. I think you mentioned that. On the other side, it's like, well, it doesn't really affect me.
Right.
And actually, it doesn't even really exist.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I think the number of people who think that climate change doesn't really shrunk. So I and waste a lot of time arguing with those folks. I did get, remember, just Thanksgiving. But generally, I try not to put my energy in that direction. I think the question of is it really going to affect me is more potent, or guilt. You know, like, oh, I have a lifestyle that uses a lot. You know, I don't want to think about this other stuff. Can also be a barrier. So let me tell a couple of good news stories about how it is, I think, starting to work. You all know the CIA, right? The CIA, by the way, the Central Intelligence Agency, has identified climate change as a major threat to national security and the Pentagon because of all the wars that are predicted to happen around the world over water and food. But there's another CIA. There's a new CIA. Anybody know what it is? It's called the Cowboy Indian Alliance. Isn't that great? It's in the American West. Native Americans and predominantly white ranchers joined together to stop the Keystone XL pipeline. How many people know what that is? Okay, lots of folks, great. The Keystone XL pipeline was a plan to ship tar sands oil, which is the dirtiest oil in the world, the worst kind for climate change, to ship it from Alberta, Canada, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico through pipes that would run right across the United States. And mostly for export, not even for US use. And so various groups along the way banded together to say, we don't want this, including this Cowboy Indian Alliance, who was a really important part. And at a climate march a few years ago, the Forward on Climate rally in DC some of the Native American leaders and leaders from Canada. The Native people of Canada are called First Nations people. And some of their leaders spoke very movingly about this. And one of the women elders said, she talked about a pipeline fight that was in Canada that was also about shipping this dirty oil. And she said, this is the first time in my life I've seen white people and Native people work together. And the thing is, we've figured out we all drink the same water. These projects, you know, almost always affect the water, whether it's oil or gas or coal. We all drink the same water. In South Africa, there's a fight against fracking, which is the extreme form of natural gas. And I should say, by the way, do people know the term extreme extraction? A few people. So basically, if you're my age or older, you might have heard a ways back that we were going to run out of fossil fuels. Anybody remember hearing that? That was the big thing we were worried about, running out of fossil fuels. So what happened was, instead of investing in renewable energy, the oil companies like Exxon, who knew that climate change was real before many of you were born, which would really make me mad, actually, if I were 19. Exxon knew before you were born that what they were doing was fueling climate change, and they kept doing it. The fossil fuel companies, instead of investing in renewable, found more and more extreme ways of getting fossil fuels. So mountaintop removal is called extreme coal extraction. Fracking is the extreme way of getting natural gas, where they go very deep underground and crack open the shale, inject chemical-filled water to get out natural gas. The extreme form of oil. So all of these extreme forms of extraction basically poison the water of people who live nearby. And then there's excess stuff that they have to get rid of, like the coal ash. So it has extra water that gets dumped in somebody's community. But people are starting to see these connections. So in South Africa, the landowners and the landless peoples movement got together to fight fracking. Now, if you know any South African history, it's pretty much analogous to the Cowboy-Indian Alliance. It's the people whose ancestors lost the land because of colonialism, and the people whose ancestors got the land because of colonialism, working together because they all drink the same water. There's something to me about these stories that are starting to happen in different places that's very hopeful. And it feels like it's important to acknowledge both that we are all drinking the same water and that the effects are unequal. I think if we just say one or the other, we're not getting the whole truth. I went to a conference one time that had this same title, I think it was Climate, Race, and Justice. And the subtitle was, We're All in This Together. And as I thought about it, I thought, yeah, we're all in this together, kind of like we're all on the Titanic together. We're all on a ship that's in trouble, but some of us have access to lifeboats. So the choice for humanity is, are we going to fight over the lifeboats, or are we going to try and move the ship? So that's my argument, that even those of us, and I would include myself, who have access to a lifeboat because I have more resources than many people in the world, it's still really in my best interest to try and move the ship, especially because I don't know how things will affect my children or future generations. So what is Earthquaker Action? Well, we were founded in 2010 as a result of a speech that was given to Quakers in this region by a man named George Lakey, who's been an activist since the 1950s. And he said, if we're really serious that climate change might be catastrophic, shouldn't we try and use techniques that have actually worked? It's great to change our light bulbs. It's great to eat more vegetarian or ride a bike instead of a car, if you can. But at the end of the day, we have to change bigger institutions if we're really going to affect what happens? We have to change places like Duke Energy, which is a big, powerful institution. And so he called on Quakers to revive our tradition of nonviolent direct action. Quakers have actually been getting thrown in jail since the 1700s, or 17th century, 1600s in Britain. We were founded with this really crazy, radical idea that there's that of God in every person, even women, even people who were enslaved. Anybody could talk to God directly. You didn't need a priest or a minister. So they threw thousands of Quakers in jail. And throughout our history, we've had a history of showing up in social struggle to get the vote for women. Quakers were leading, especially the direct action, women out there getting arrested in front of the White House, way before that was a hip thing to do at all. Quakers were involved in the abolition movement, in the Underground Railroad, in fighting nuclear testing. And so George Lakey called on us to revive this tradition and to use the kind of tactics that the civil rights movement had used, that Gandhi had used, that had been effective in changing big institutions. And so we were founded with a mission of using nonviolent direct action to work for a just and sustainable economy. Now, I mentioned that our first campaign was around mountaintop removal coal mining. And the reason that we picked that is we try and be very strategic. We try and see there's all these big problems. What's the little piece that we could pick of a big problem that could have a lasting impact? And PNC Bank, is St. Joe's a PNC? Villanova, sorry. What did I just say? Gosh, sorry. I was just testing that you were still awake.
St. Joe's is the one.
St. Joe's, that's what I was thinking. Yeah. Anyway, some of the area colleges have relationships with PNC. So PNC had Quaker roots. And so a lot of Quaker institutions had money in PNC Bank. They like to brag about being a green bank. They also were one of the biggest financiers of mountaintop removal coal mining. And we said, yeah, we're not going to let you get away with that. So we campaigned for 5 years to get them to stop investing in mountaintop removal. When we first started, the CEO, well, you should just go change the law. We'll just do whatever the politicians tell us to do. It's not our job to be moral. It's our job to make money. He might not have used those exact words. That was pretty much what he said. And we said, no. We have given up on our politicians regulating you because you give them so much money. We're pushing you to change. And so for 5 years, we used a variety of tactics. We did really countercultural things, like going into PNC Bank lobbies, sitting down on the floor and praying. They didn't know what to do with us. We were not their normal stereotype of shouting, angry activists. We were people of faith showing up, exercising our faith, and really feeling called to do this. And here's the great news. How many people know the great news? We won. They changed the policy that they never thought they'd change. Now, to me, part of this that really needs to be lifted up is that PNC in 2014 netted $4.2 billion. And our little group had an annual budget of $100,000. We don't even have a full-time staff person. We don't even have an office. We had faith and persistence and creativity. And we're also intergenerational, by the way, because there's great creativity that comes from people in their 70s and 80s who have done peace work for decades, and younger people who know that climate change is going to affect them in particular, who have creativity and smarts and energy and social media skills. And so that campaign was very successful. Now, one thing happened during that campaign, and I sort of alluded to it already. I mentioned that some African-American Quakers raised this question of, gee whiz, why'd you pick Appalachia first? And that's hard. And actually, because pervasive issue in our society, many of us started feeling like, well, what are we supposed to do about racism? We have a very strong ethic of staying on mission. Quakers, one of the bad things of Quakers being involved in lots of issues is we have a tendency to go protest whatever happened in the news last week. Thing. And that's not, frankly, effective. So we were founded with a very strong mission of pick one thing and work on that. So we kind of felt like, what are we supposed to do around racism? And we had conversations, got clear that we're not to go try and recruit 1 or 2 more people of color. A lot of environmental groups are doing that. And I think there's a desire for wholeness and inclusion that's good, but I think there's a way we can do that that becomes tokenism. If we just have a few more people of color, that's okay, and we can put them on our website and we'll look a certain kind of way. And we just knew we didn't want to do that. But we weren't sure what we were called to do. And so we had this sort of sense of spiritual openness. So we feel called to do something, we're not sure what it is, but we'll just be on the lookout for it. Well, it was only like a week or so later that Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And all the activism started around that, the Black Lives Matter protests. And our staff person got a request. Now we have, at that point we had 2 part-time staff people, and one of them is a young African-American man named Matthew Armstead, who also does training with a group called Training for Change, nonviolent training. And through Training for Change, he got this request, will you come to Ferguson and help support the activists there in learning how to do effective nonviolent action? And Matthew read the list of what they were looking for. He's like, oh, that's me, oh, that's me, oh, that's me, oh, that's me. I don't want to go to Ferguson. It was kind of like the Exodus story. Moses is like, I think you have the wrong guy, But after sitting with it and praying over it, Matthew realized that he really was called to go to Ferguson. And me and other leaders of Equate, I'm the chair of the board, and he said, I think I'm called to do this thing weeks, but I can't actually afford to go getting paid by my job. And so would you support me? We very quickly came to the decision that we wanted to support and pay his salary while he did this work in Ferguson. And what was special about it, I think, was that Matthew's calling was especially around healing. He had this sense that there was a way that he could go in support of activists there that came from a very spiritual place while also being strategic. So we also had to jump in to kind of cover his job while he was gone. And when he came back, we heard these very powerful stories about how Matthew did this work. A lot of the activists in Ferguson had lost their driver's licenses because of, if you followed that whole story, the way the police target the African American community. So Matthew had his Prius, and he would drive people from meeting and listen and support them. And that way of being, those stories were helpful to me in thinking about how to do this work in a way that's not a savior swooping in to save somebody, but to really support the resources that people already have. Now, Matthew right away said, this would be a great fundraiser for Equate. You can make money off of it. But we just kind of felt, there's a lot of white groups that do things like that. In fact, I immediately got fundraising appeals from groups saying, hey, you want to help people in Ferguson? Give money to us. Groups that are not actually in Ferguson. And we didn't want to do that. So we actually haven't told this story very much publicly. But the reason I'm telling you here is it's a different way of thinking about the connections than what most people would think of. It's an indirect way. It's a way of thinking, how can we do our work in a way that supports other people doing their piece of the work? So sometime later, we won this campaign. It was actually a few months later after Matthew came back. We won the campaign in Appalachia, and we had to decide, what do we want to do next? And we had this really strong sense that we wanted to do something that was related to racial justice this time, while still keeping our focus on climate change. We also had a sense that we wanted to work on what some people call a solutions campaign. So we don't want to just stop the bad stuff, which is important, but we also build the new world that we want to see. So our new campaign is called Power Local Green Jobs, and our target this time is PECO. PECO, our local utility for southeastern Pennsylvania. PECO right now has such a small amount of solar energy in its mix that if you're over 40, you have to put your glasses on to see it. It's like a small fraction of a percent is how much comes from solar. Other places are way ahead of us. If you drive around Vermont, where it's colder than here, they have tons more solar than we do, lots of other states. So we're pressuring PECO to make a major shift to rooftop solar. So what does this have to do with race and economic justice? Well, solar is a kind of energy where people can benefit from the energy savings directly, and it creates a lot of jobs. Because we don't have to pay for the sun, the money you pay for solar mostly goes toward workers and installation and the solar panels. And so our campaign is to push for solar and to prioritize parts of our community that have been underdeveloped, that have been neglected in investment in recent decades. And so we're pushing for them to start in North Philadelphia, to prioritize buying solar from North Philadelphia. Now, part of what's exciting about this is there's already people in North Philadelphia working to create solar business. So we're not trying to, tell them what to do. We're trying to push this big institution to make more space for them to do it, to create more opportunity, and people in that neighborhood are figuring out how to get the training, create the business models that will create jobs in those communities. I think I'll say one more thing and then I'll open it up for questions again. When I, a few years ago, went to a concert of a group called Tribe One, which is an interracial, interfaith musical group, and the leader is an African-American Quaker named Neonu Span. They have great music, and because Neonu is really a teacher and a facilitator, in between the music, she might make the audience work a little. So on this one occasion, she invited the audience to articulate what was their vision for a better world that they wanted to see. And the first person who came up to the mic and spoke said that her vision was of people doing a circle dance together. She had spent time in Israel and Palestine and had this vision of people coming together across those divisions. And the second person who spoke said that her vision was around the environment and protecting the environment. And I just had this moment of clarity that my vision was about connecting those two. And the words that came to me were that it's not about us saving the earth. The earth's going to continue even if humanity doesn't. It's not about us saving the earth, but the crisis of the earth is inviting us to heal our illusion of separation. The crisis of the earth, all these terrible things, are helping people to see that we're all connected, even though the effects are not equal. And so that's my invitation to you, whether you're here because you had to come for a class or you're trying to figure out how to make a difference on climate change, to recognize that these issues are connected and we can be more effective if we understand that it's all part of the same struggle for a better world, which I think is the world articulated in the Pope's encyclical. The encyclical uses the word integral 25 times because it's all about the connection. So, thank you for listening. Now, I think Julie's going to keep time, and you'll know how.
We have half an hour
Okay, great.
It's a kind of when you talked about going into the bank and praying, prayer obviously was for your group. And I find very, very often that a group that prays doesn't have any way to get everybody else or anybody else to understand the role that prayer plays, because it looks like you're looking for a magical solution. Oh God, you take care of it, I can't.
Yeah.
And so even to use the language of praying is to appear to check out of the problem. And so could you talk a little bit about how prayer supports your efforts to bring together, and whether there have been any successes in overcoming some of the divisions precisely because a community prays? Because oftentimes the communities that are least well off are the ones that are best at praying.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that question. I really appreciate it. My last book was on the Serenity Prayer, and one of the things I talk about is how religion can be used to empower people, or it can be used to tell people to be quiet. My mother used to quote an Irish nun who she had in school, and I hope I won't offend anybody, but I grew up on this saying, "You are put on this earth to suffer for the glory of Christ, and the sooner you get used to it, the better off you'll be." That is not my theology. When I pray, I'm way more likely to pray for strength to do what I'm called to do than for God to solve the problem. I actually think God needs us to do this work, that we are the hands of the divine on earth. So I'll tell you a story about how we've used prayer. I've gotten arrested twice doing civil disobedience, and both times were around the Keystone XL pipeline issue. I mentioned that Quaker Action Team is very focused on our own campaign, but this was a case where we decided we wanted to support the national movement, which was really focused on this pipeline, which had become very symbolic, and which, by the way, we won that campaign too, in case you missed the news. President Obama was planning to approve it until people started doing civil disobedience and other kind of activism. Then he put it on hold for a really long time. He was getting lobbied very hard from both sides, and ultimately rejected the pipeline precisely because so many people showed up to say no. So in Philadelphia, we organized an action at the federal building. We had about 200 people there. I think it was about 40 people who were willing to risk arrest. And we say it that way because we're not actually trying to get arrested. It's not like it's fun to go to jail. And we don't want to make light of that. Many people go to jail not by choice. But we're willing to risk arrest because it's a way of showing the seriousness of the issue. It carries a kind of moral weight to say I'm willing to sacrifice for something for this. It also, frankly, gets more TV coverage. But that's not the core reason. So at this event in front of the federal building, we had like 200 people. The police started arresting people. And frankly, the police don't really want to arrest you. It's a lot of paperwork for them. They want to see if they can avoid that. And so they were trying to divide us. We had an interfaith group there. So a lot of the Quakers were at one door. A lot of our rabbi friends were at another door. People of mixed background were at another door. And so they started with the Quaker door and started arresting people. And then some of the other folks came and joined us. At the end of the day, Rabbi Arthur Waskow, who spoke at the panel Julie recently organized, he was 80 at the time. He got down on his back and he slid under the barricade to get into the side where people were being arrested. But anyway, so we were doing this action. They started arresting people, and then they were trying to figure out what to do, so they kind of paused. And we had been singing all day. We sing a lot of different kinds of songs, but several are from the civil rights movement. And so we were singing, "Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom." And it was like 2 in the afternoon, and we're still singing this song. And so I said to the song leader who was next to me, "Let's call for prayer." And she said, okay, great, you do it. And so I invited people. I remembered hearing a story of someone doing this before. And I invited the crowd to pray with us and to consider what we were doing to the earth. And to consider why we were there, and that we were praying for our ability to make a difference for not just our own children, but the children of the police, and the children of the people from the corporation that's trying to push through this pipeline. And it was really amazing. The whole crowd, it was like a wave of silence fell. Now, if you don't know anything about Quakers, silence is the kind of ground from our prayer, which actually makes it very easy to invite in other people. And so I said, if you're a person from a different faith tradition, you can pray in whatever way makes sense to you. If you're not from a faith tradition, this is a chance for us to center ourselves in what we're doing here. But this wave of silence kind of went over the crowd, and people who were on the edge who couldn't hear me, it was like they heard the silence come. And one of the police officers went and turned off the radio. And later, there's a picture on Twitter of an African-American police officer with his head bowed during the silence, which lasted way longer than you would think. And at the end of it, my partner, Lena, the song leader, started singing another old civil rights song, Guide My Feet. And the people who were still in the middle joined hands and started walking in a circle. And then the police started arresting us again. And my observation of it is that it's way more scary for them to see something that's actually powerful in a spiritual way than to have a bunch of people shouting. We've seen that in other actions, that the activists who just go in, let's be as loud as we can, they ignore them. But as I said before, they weren't sure what to do with us. And so that's one story of it. I appreciate the question. Any students have any questions?
So I have a question.
Oh, you're letting them off the hook.
Well,
I'm a Quaker. I can out-silence you for a really long time, but go ahead.
still a student. My observation is that this is a pretty knowledgeable group, right? And oftentimes I feel as if groups like this, you're preaching to the choir. And we actually had Mary Pfeiffer, who wrote The Green Boat, which was about the XL pipeline coming through her home state of Nebraska, come and speak. And nobody came. And it wasn't for lack of trying, right? And I feel as if there are so many other issues of social justice, and I do agree that environment touches on a lot of them, but there's this big social justice umbrella, right? What do you do with that?
So a couple things that I would say. One is to appreciate how it's all connected and name it. There's a book called This Changes Everything, which some of you may have heard about, by Naomi Klein, which talks about how the climate crisis, any kind of crisis invites opportunity for rapid change. And the climate crisis, like the utilities are going to have to change the way they do business. So let's pressure them to do it in the best way possible, that it's an opportunity, and that we're better able to do that when we see that the fight again to keep funding for our public schools and the fight to keep funding for our libraries is related in a way because of this whole move toward privatization. That the fights that make it clear that we value community institutions are all part of the same thing. My only criticism of that book is I feel like she skates around racism. She mentions, that the disparities fall along racial lines, but I think that recognizing that racism actually supports the system as it is in other ways. So my friends who feel called to work on racism, it's like, great, let's just pray for each other or support each other or whatever. In terms of the nobody came thing, I get that's real, and probably somebody came. So what can we do with the somebodies who came? When Quaker Action Team started, it was a really small group. It was a handful of people who got together and said, what can we do? And what we found is that many people are joining now because they can see that we're up to something exciting. I think it's part of the reason we've had a lot of college students and people in their 20s, because we're not just sitting around talking about stuff, we're doing stuff. And some people are going to come to the talk, which is great as a public speaker. I like it when you come to the talk. But some people don't want to come to the talk. They just want to show up for when you're taking some kind of action. And that's valid too, I think. So that would be my question is, how can we just move as far as we can with the people we've got?
You just mentioned public schools and libraries, and how would you think that this racial climate issue ties into public education?
Yeah, so it might seem like a stretch. So the argument in this book is that over the last several decades, conservative forces in our country have pushed this story that we're better off when we're just individuals. They've pushed a story that government is bad. And so paying taxes is bad because it supports the government. And you know what? When Hurricane Sandy hit, even Governor Christie liked the government, right? When there's a big disaster, people suddenly realize that they need each other, that they need community institutions. And so it's not so much that the public library and public school funding is directly tied to climate change, but it's partly of how we understand ourselves as community. That if we understand that we're all better off when a certain amount of our resources go to community institutions that help everyone, that actually builds a certain kind of spirit in our country. And that climate change is an issue that is going to make that really clear. That just me, being free and waving the flag by myself is not actually going to help me in an emergency. So it's more along those lines. Does that make sense?
We're going to take advantage, we still have plenty of time, but I know sometimes people have to leave for classes. And I wanted to, again, remind folks about the books and also this, if you'd say a little bit about the signups. And also Marion, sorry.
It's okay.
Brought something to share. Do you want to say just a word about this, and I can send it around before folks start?
Dr. Lafferty was going to pass this out to her class today, and she showed it to me, and it really is very and his beliefs. He's really kind of following Pope John II, Pope Paul John II, in his belief of kindness, forgiveness, being active, and peace, and joy, and community, and so forth. So I just thought I'd like to share it.
Great. We'll send it around, and folks can take that along.
Well, when you read it, you'll enjoy it.
Okay. So, sorry for the interruption, and please continue the conversation.
Sure, and so Julie asked me to mention the book. So the book, Renewable, is a memoir of my coming to this work, and it has a lot about, I was in the Peace Corps in Botswana in the 80s, so it has a lot of those stories. And there's a few copies of the earlier one on the Serenity Prayer. There's also a sign up for my personal mailing list, which I do not use very often, but every once in a while. There's also a sign up for Quaker Action Team. We're going to have a major action on May 10th. If any of you are interested in checking out what we're doing for local green jobs, you can sign up on the Equate mailing list as well and get an email inviting you to that. So I know some people have to sneak out, but if other people are willing to stay a minute, I could give you an assignment. Can I just take the pulse of the room? Are a few people willing to hang out a little bit more? Sure. All right, great. So I'm a little worried that I'm leaving you all with despair, which is not what I want to do at all. I want to leave you with hope. So let's just take a minute and turn to a neighbor and share, what do you think are the things you can do in your own life that actually make a difference on climate change? And if you don't have any, then we have something to talk about. And if you do, we can hear each other's ideas.
I don't know how you deal with the frustration of a huge interconnected system
Yeah,
where you're really having a sense of, am I really making a difference?
right. Thank you for saying that. That was one of the things that really had me stuck in despair before I started doing direct action. I do think that all the things we do as an individual add up. So whether it's credit cards or where you buy your energy. I also find that now that I'm seeing big institutions being challenged, it makes me more hopeful. So it's easier for me to like hang my laundry instead of putting it in the dryer. Sisters are way ahead on solar panels and other kind of lead things. I should say, after I made the joke about the Irish nun and you're put on this earth to suffer, that today actually many communities are way ahead on green building stuff. Guess what is the most green country in the world? Nope. They're doing really well.
Yeah, they came out number 1 today in UN and stuff.
It depends on what you count as a country, but the Vatican. The Vatican. But, it's the advantage of having someone at the top wanting to put solar panels on everything. But if your township won't let you do a solar field, why not do a solar roof? If you can buy as an individual renewable energy, that's great. If you can convince an institution to buy solar energy, that's even better. Whether it's your school, your university, your church, your congregation, what have you. The bigger, and it's become more and more affordable. For, as you said, it can pay for itself. So there are ways to do it, but you're right, the system is not set up to make it easy, which is exactly why we're going after PICO. Because PICO could be making it easy, and they're making it difficult. Other solutions people came up with?
I just wanted to ask him, did you ever challenge that person or try to find out if that was really the truth that in the township? See, because
Yeah.
Sometimes people will say that, oh no, we could never do that because Radnor Township wouldn't do it. And that's just, a way of saying, oh, well, I never got around to doing that, or I didn't think it was important, or, this is like way down here on my list of what's interesting. They're building this huge complex over, and the main lot, I mean, all of that stuff should really be in the building right now. I mean, it should all be environmentally friendly. And, I mean, why wouldn't you do that now? I mean, we're
Right.
at an age, we don't have to retrofit anything. Why don't we just do it right now? I don't know, maybe they are though.
I think they're very sensitive to that whole lead, the lead. Yeah, but definitely, we started that a while ago.
Right, yeah, I mean, it would be nice, especially, like I said, you don't have to retrofit everything. You don't have to maybe go back and do toll and time, though that could be done in general. Oh,
Yeah, when you finally get around to fixing Toll and Town, that's what I'm doing.
right, exactly. Well, maybe they'll wait long enough so it will also be solar energy.
But I think it's great that you raised the question. And again, I think the more people raise the question. So if one person raises the question, they might take it and they might not. If lots of people, if alumni raise the question, if donors raise the question, if faculty raise the question, and students raise the question, they're going to pay attention to the question. They may or may not do what you want, but they're going to at least be, maybe we'll find out, is it really illegal in Radnor Township? So, all right, any last thing, or are we about done? I think we're about done. All right, thank you, everybody.